Picture this: a vast desert battlefield. The sun is hammering down like a furnace from above. Thousands of soldiers are surrounded, trapped on a hill with no water, no escape, and no hope. Their horses are dying of thirst. Their armor is cooking them alive. And standing on the other side of that battlefield, calm, patient, utterly in control, is one man. He is not the biggest man on that field. He is not the loudest, but every single soldier on both sides of that battle knows his name. In a few hours, this one battle will change history forever. The armies of the Crusaders, the most feared warriors in the Western world, will be shattered, and one of the holiest cities on earth will be recaptured after nearly 90 years of occupation. But here's the thing that makes Saladin truly remarkable. It's not just that he won. It's how he won, and even more, it's what he did after. Because the story of Saladin is not just a story about swords and battles. It's a story about a boy from a small town who rose to lead an entire civilization. It's a story about faith, mercy, loyalty, and what it truly means to be great. So stay with me, because this story, it is one of the most incredible in all of human history. Chapter 1. A boy born in the middle of history. Okay, let's go back, way back. All the way back to the year 1137, or possibly 1138. Historians aren't totally sure of the exact year, and that's actually pretty normal for people born almost 900 years ago. What we do know is where. Fun fact: Tikrit, that's the town in present-day Iraq where Saladin was born, sits along the banks of the mighty Tigris River, one of the two great rivers of ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was called the land between the rivers, and it's one of the oldest places of human civilization on earth. People had been living there for thousands of years before Saladin was even born. His full name, and hold on because this is a mouthful, was Salahudin Yusuf ibn Ayyub. In Arabic, that roughly means Yusuf, son of Ayyub, righteousness of the faith. Let's break that down, because names in this time period were like little stories in themselves. Yusuf, that's the Arabic form of the name Joseph. It was a deeply meaningful name, shared by a beloved prophet in both Islam and the Bible. Ibn Ayyub means son of Ayyub, Ayyub being his father's name, and Salah al-Din, that was an honorific title, a kind of grand nickname given to honor a person's greatness. It means righteousness of the faith. Think of it like this. Imagine if your name meant hero of justice or champion of goodness. Pretty cool, right? Now, Saladin's family wasn't just any family. They were Kurdish, part of an ancient people from the mountainous borderlands of what is now Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Syria. The Kurds had a long warrior tradition, and Saladin's family was right in the middle of that world. His father was a man named Najm al-Din Ayyub, a skilled military commander and administrator. The night Saladin was born, something unusual happened. His father had just been appointed governor of the city of Tikrit, but almost immediately after little Saladin came into the world, the family was forced to leave the city under complicated political circumstances. Legend says that Najm al-Din himself called the birth of his son a bad omen that very night, and yet he would live to see that same son become the most famous warrior and ruler in the entire Islamic world. Sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the humblest, or even the most troubled, starts. The family packed up everything and headed north. Their destination? A place called Baalbek. And that is where the real story of young Saladin begins. Stay with me, because what happens next shapes him into the man he will become. Chapter 2. Growing up between ruins and roses. Baalbek. Say the name aloud, Baalbek. It's a city in what is now modern Lebanon, nestled in a wide valley between two mountain ranges, and it is, quite simply, one of the most spectacular places in the entire Middle East. Fun fact: Baalbek is home to some of the most enormous Roman temple ruins on earth. The temple of Jupiter there had columns so tall, over 20 meters high, that you have to crane your neck completely back just to see the tops. And these weren't just standing when Saladin was young. They were still being used, still being marveled at. Imagine growing up in the shadow of those ancient columns every single day. Saladin's uncle, his father's older brother, was a man named Shirkuh, and Shirkuh was no ordinary man. He was a fierce, bold, barrel-chested military commander who worked in the service of a powerful ruler named Nur al-Din, the Sultan of the Zangid dynasty based in the great city of Damascus. Let's pause there and understand the world Saladin was growing up in, because without understanding that world, none of the rest of his story makes sense. The year is roughly 1140. The Middle East is a deeply divided place. The Islamic world, stretching from Spain in the west all the way to Central Asia in the east, is broken into dozens of competing kingdoms, sultanates, and caliphates. They often fight each other as much as anyone else. But there's another force in the region too. 50 years before Saladin was born, in the year 1099, an army of European Christian warriors, the Crusaders, had swept in from Europe and after brutal fighting captured the city of Jerusalem. They set up their own kingdoms in the Holy Land, calling them the Crusader states. Jerusalem. That city matters enormously, not just to Christians, but to Jews and Muslims alike. For Muslims, Jerusalem is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, among the holiest sites in Islam. The loss of Jerusalem was a wound that the Islamic world had not forgotten. Young Saladin grew up understanding all of this. He was born into a world at war, and into a family that was deeply embedded in that war. In Baalbek, and later in Damascus, his childhood was shaped by two very different kinds of teachers. The first were the scholars. Saladin received a rigorous classical Islamic education. He studied the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and memorized large portions of it from a very young age. He studied fiqh, Islamic law. He studied Arabic poetry, history, and grammar. He was sharp, curious, and deeply devoted to his faith. Fun fact, Arabic poetry was a huge part of education in medieval Islamic culture, not just as entertainment, but as a way of training the mind, expressing emotion, and understanding history. Saladin loved poetry his entire life, and could recite vast amounts of it from memory. The second kind of teacher, the soldiers around him. His father, Najm al-Din, was a skilled administrator. His uncle Shirkuh was a war hero. The men who visited their household were military commanders, knights, and strategists. From a young age, Saladin absorbed the rhythms and logic of military life, how armies moved, how cities were defended, how leaders commanded loyalty. But here's an interesting thing about young Saladin. By all accounts, he was not immediately obsessed with war. He was quiet, thoughtful. He preferred books and theology to the training yard. It was only gradually, pushed by his uncle and by circumstances, that the military genius within him began to emerge. Damascus. That is where the family eventually settled most fully, and where Saladin truly came of age. Damascus was then, as it is now, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth. A place of narrow winding streets, brilliant bazaars, the smell of spices and roses, the sound of the call to prayer, echoing off ancient stone walls. In Damascus, Saladin read and prayed and learned. He was becoming something rare, a man who was equally at home in a library and on a battlefield. And soon, very soon, he was going to need both. Chapter 3, Into the Storm the Egyptian Campaigns. The year is 1163. Saladin is around 25 or 26 years old, and his uncle Shirkuh has just received orders from Nur al-Din that will set the entire course of Saladin's life. Egypt. Now Egypt in the 1160s was ruled by a dynasty called the Fatimids. The Fatimids were Muslims, yes, but they were of the Shia branch of Islam, while Nur al-Din's Zangid dynasty and most of the surrounding world was Sunni. We'll come back to why that matters. The Fatimid Caliphate had once been the most powerful dynasty in the Islamic world, but by 1163 it was crumbling. Weak caliphs, scheming viziers, economic problems, and the threat of crusader armies circling like wolves on the doorstep. Quick vocabulary lesson. A vizier is like a prime minister, the chief government official who runs the day-to-day affairs of a kingdom. A caliphate is a state led by a caliph, a religious and political leader considered the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. The Fatimids had their own caliph in Cairo. Here's the problem. Both the Crusaders and Nur al-Din wanted Egypt. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the richest land in the region. Vast farmland, the mighty Nile River, massive tax revenues, and strategic access to both North Africa and the Red Sea. It was a race, and Nur al-Din sent Shirkuh, with young Saladin as his second-in-command, to win it. Saladin did not especially want to go. Historical records suggest he actually asked to be excused from the first expedition. He preferred the life of a scholar administrator, but his uncle insisted, and duty called. There were 3 campaigns into Egypt in 1163, 1167, and 1168 to 1169. They were complicated, exhausting, and dangerous. At various times, Shirkuh and Saladin found themselves fighting both the Crusaders and rival Egyptian factions. At one point, they were virtually besieged inside a town called Alexandria, with a Crusader army camped outside their walls. Fun fact: during the siege of Alexandria in 1167, Saladin was left in command of the city, while Shirkuh went to maneuver outside. This was one of his first true tests as an independent commander. He was surrounded, he was young, and he held on. That siege helped forge the military coolness under pressure that would define him. The campaigns were messy and full of shifting alliances, the kind of war where today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. But through it all, Saladin distinguished himself. He was brave, he was organized, he earned the respect of the Egyptian soldiers as well as his own men. He had a quality that the best leaders always have: he made people want to follow him. And then in January of 1169, everything changed in an instant. Shirkuh, the great commander, Saladin's uncle and mentor, died suddenly. He had become vizier of Egypt just weeks before, after the third campaign finally brought Nur al-Din's forces fully into control of Cairo. And then, just 2 months after taking power, Shirkuh died of what appears to have been a sudden illness. In a heartbeat, the most powerful position in Egypt was vacant. Saladin was around 31 years old. He was the most prominent military leader on the ground. The Egyptian caliph and his court thought, perhaps foolishly, that young Saladin would be easy to control. They were wrong. What Saladin did next with that power would shock everyone and reshape the entire Islamic world. Chapter 4. The most powerful man in Egypt. The title of Vizier of Egypt. Let that sink in for a moment. In the 1100s, Egypt was not just a country. It was a civilization. Home to Cairo, one of the great cities of the medieval world, and the Nile River Valley, which had been feeding humanity for thousands of years. Being Vizier of Egypt meant controlling vast armies, enormous tax revenues, and one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate on the planet. Saladin took that office in 1169, and he immediately began to do something very, very smart. He started replacing unreliable officials with loyal, competent people, many of them from his own family and his father's network of Kurdish and Syrian officers. His father, Najm al-Din, came to Egypt. His brothers came. Trusted commanders from Syria came. Slowly, quietly, Saladin began transforming the Egyptian military and administration into a machine he could rely on. He also began rebuilding Egypt's defenses. Cairo itself was not well fortified. He started the construction of the famous Citadel of Cairo, a massive fortress on a limestone hill overlooking the city that still stands today and is still one of Cairo's most iconic landmarks. Fun fact: the Citadel of Cairo, which Saladin began building around 1176, took decades to complete. Today, over 800 years after Saladin started it, you can still visit this fortress. It has been expanded and modified by many rulers over the centuries, but the core of it, the vision of it, was Saladin's. But there was a deeper, more delicate problem to solve. Egypt was officially still ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimid Caliph, at this time a man named Al-Adid, was still technically Saladin's boss. But the Fatimids were Shia Muslims, while Saladin was a devout Sunni. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam is one of the oldest and deepest divides in Islamic history, going back to a dispute over the rightful leadership of the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Here's a simple way to think about it. Both Sunni and Shia Muslims believe in the same God, follow the same Quran, and respect the Prophet Muhammad, but they disagreed, centuries earlier, about who should lead the community. That disagreement led to different traditions, different practices, and at times deep political and religious rivalry. Saladin was a committed Sunni. He had been sent to Egypt by Nur al-Din, a Sunni ruler, and he believed that reuniting Egypt with the broader Sunni world was both a religious duty and a political necessity. He moved carefully. He didn't rush. He waited for the right moment. In September 1171, that moment came. The Fatimid Caliph al-Adid fell gravely ill. In mosques across Egypt, the Friday prayers, which always included a declaration of loyalty to the reigning caliph, were quietly changed. Instead of praying in the name of the Fatimid Caliph, they began to pray in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. the spiritual leader of the Sunni world. Al-Adid died just a few days later, apparently unaware of what had happened. Just like that, without a battle, without bloodshed, the Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for over 2 centuries, was over. Egypt was now Sunni. Saladin was master of Egypt in both name and reality. But his ambitions did not stop there, because to truly free Jerusalem, which Saladin had pledged to do, he needed more than Egypt. He needed everything. He needed all the fractured Muslim states of the region to unite behind a single cause. And to do that, he would need to become something even greater than a vizier. He would need to become a sultan. Chapter 5. Building an Empire, Piece by Piece. A sultan is a ruler, a sovereign, not just a governor or a minister, but a king in all but name, though Saladin always respected the formal religious authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. He wasn't trying to replace religion, he was trying to use his political power in service of his faith. The opportunity to take that next step came in 1174 with a tragic death. Nur al-Din, the powerful Zangid ruler of Syria, the man who had been Saladin's ultimate boss throughout all the Egyptian campaigns, died in May 1174. He left behind a young son as heir, but the boy was only 11 years old. The Syrian territories immediately began to fragment as various commanders and princes fought over control. Saladin moved quickly. He crossed from Egypt into Syria, and within a remarkably short time, he took control of Damascus, the great city where he had grown up. Now here's where Saladin showed something important about his character. He could have declared himself in total revolt against the Zangid dynasty. He could have made enemies of everyone who had served Nur al-Din. Instead, he presented himself as a protector, not a conqueror. He said he was acting as a guardian for Nur al-Din's young heir, protecting the legacy of the man who had shaped him. Was this completely true? Historians debate that. But what's not debatable is the result. Saladin managed to take control of Damascus with minimal bloodshed, and he went on to be recognized by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as the independent Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Over the next several years, from 1174 to roughly 1186, Saladin embarked on one of the most remarkable campaigns of political and military unification in medieval history. He absorbed Aleppo, he brought Mosul into his orbit, he made alliances, pressured rivals, and sometimes fought brief wars when necessary. One by one, the fragmented Muslim principalities of Syria, northern Iraq, and parts of northern Arabia began to come under his authority. And throughout all of this, Saladin never lost sight of his ultimate goal, Jerusalem. He wrote letters to the Abbasid Caliph speaking of jihad, a word we should explain carefully here. Jihad, in Arabic, literally means striving or struggle. In Islamic teaching, it refers primarily to the inner struggle to be a good and faithful person. But it also has a secondary meaning, armed struggle in defense of the Muslim community. In the context of Saladin's era, the word was used to describe the effort to reclaim Jerusalem and the holy sites from Crusader control. For Saladin, uniting the Muslim world was his jihad. Every diplomatic mission, every battle, every alliance, it was all pointing toward that one distant goal. But not everyone was happy about Saladin's rise to power, and some of them were willing to send killers to stop him. The next chapter of Saladin's story is terrifying, and barely believed even by those who witnessed it. Chapter 6, The Assassin's Strike. Deep in the mountains of Syria, in a fortress called Masyaf, lived one of the most feared organizations in the medieval world. They were called the Nizari Ismaili, a sect of Shia Muslims who had set themselves apart from the rest of the Islamic world. But in the stories and legends of the time, and even in many historical accounts, they were known by another name, the Assassins. The word assassin actually comes from a word that may be linked to this group, though the exact origin is debated. What's not debated is that they were real, that they were deadly, and that they used targeted killings as a political weapon. They would send highly trained agents, disguised as servants or merchants or pilgrims, to get close to powerful leaders and then strike. And in 1175 and again in 1176, they came for Saladin. The first attempt was in 1175. Saladin was campaigning in Syria when a group of assassins managed to penetrate his camp. The attempt failed. His guards intervened. The second attempt in 1176 was far more terrifying. This time, the assassins actually reached Saladin himself. They made it into his tent. He was only saved, according to the accounts of those who witnessed it, because he was wearing a form of armor beneath his clothing, and because his guards burst in at the last possible moment. Saladin was shaken, deeply shaken. He reportedly began sleeping in a special elevated wooden structure that couldn't be easily approached. He trusted almost no one with access to him at night. He demanded that anyone approaching him show proof of identity. But here is where Saladin's response reveals something extraordinary about his character. He did not simply launch a war of annihilation against the assassins. He could have tried to flatten their mountain fortress. Instead, after a brief military expedition toward Masyaf that did not end in conquest, Saladin came to a peace agreement with the assassin leader, Rashid al-Din Sainan. The two men reached an accommodation. The assassins would stop targeting Saladin, and Saladin would leave them in relative peace. Fun fact, the leader of the Syrian assassins, Rashid al-Din Sinan, was known in Crusader legends as the Old Man of the Mountain. He was said to be so mysterious and powerful that Crusader kings feared him almost as much as they feared Saladin himself. There's a famous story, probably more legend than fact, but told widely in medieval sources, that after the second assassination attempt, Saladin received a message from the assassins that listed in detail everything they knew about him, his sleeping habits, his bodyguards' patterns, his daily routes. Tucked alongside it was a dagger and a poisoned cake. The message was simple. We could have killed you already. Make peace. Whether this story is exactly true or not, what is true is that Saladin and the assassins reached peace, and once he was no longer worried about a knife in the dark, Saladin could turn his full attention outward, to the Crusaders, to the Holy Land, to the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. Everything was about to come together in one catastrophic, history-changing summer. Chapter 7, The Battle of Hattin, the day everything changed. It is July 1187. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast plain in the Holy Land, what is today Israel and Palestine. The summer sun is brutal, hammering the rocky brown hills like a forge. There are almost no trees. The closest water is the Sea of Galilee, a glittering blue lake in the distance. In the middle of this landscape, two armies. On one side, Saladin commands a force of roughly 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers, cavalry, archers, infantry. His men are well rested, well supplied, and fiercely motivated. They have water, they have food, they have a plan. On the other side, the combined Christian army of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. Roughly 20,000 soldiers, including the most elite knights in the world, heavily armored cavalry called chevaliers, foot soldiers, and crossbowmen. They march under the sacred banner of the true cross, a relic believed to be a fragment of the actual cross on which Jesus Christ was crucified. For Crusader soldiers, that relic meant everything. It was their most sacred object. Their leader is a man named Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and he has just made a catastrophic decision. Saladin had lured the Crusader army away from water, deliberately. He captured a town called Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, threatening it to draw the Crusaders out. A shrewd advisor named Count Raymond of Tripoli warned Guy, "Don't take the bait. Stay near water. Let Saladin come to you." Guy didn't listen. The Crusader army marched into the dry hills. Saladin's forces surrounded them, cutting off their route to water. On the night of July 3rd, the Crusaders camped on a parched hillside, their men and horses desperately thirsty. Saladin's soldiers lit fires around the entire perimeter, sending smoke rolling over the Crusader camp all night, choking the soldiers, tormenting the horses, preventing sleep. By the morning of July 4th, 1187, the Crusader army was already half destroyed before the main battle even began. And then Saladin attacked. The Battle of Hattin, named for the twin-peaked volcanic hill called the Horns of Hattin nearby, was the greatest military catastrophe in Crusader history. The Crusader infantry, desperate and disorganized, tried to fight their way to the water below. They never made it. The cavalry charged again and again, and were repulsed each time by Saladin's disciplined archers and cavalry. By midday, it was over. The vast majority of the Crusader army was captured or killed. The relic of the true cross was seized. King Guy of Jerusalem himself was taken prisoner. Saladin sat in his tent as the captured Crusader lords were brought before him. He offered King Guy a cup of iced water, a magnificent gesture of mercy. Guy passed the cup to a knight beside him named Reynald of Chatillon. Saladin stopped him. Quietly in Arabic he said, "I did not give him leave to drink," because Reynald of Chatillon was a different matter entirely. Reynald had been one of the most brutal and unpredictable crusader leaders, a man who had repeatedly broken treaties with Saladin, who had launched a daring pirate raid into the Red Sea, threatening Mecca and Medina themselves, and who had massacred travelers and merchants in violation of every code of honor. Saladin had sworn he would execute Reynald personally if he ever caught him. And now he had caught him. He drew his sword, and there in the tent Reynald of Chatillon was killed. To King Guy, Saladin was serene. "Kings do not kill kings," he said. Guy would eventually be released and allowed to leave. The rest of the captured knights of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, who were the professional warrior monks of the Crusader world, were executed. This was a harsh decision, and it speaks to how seriously Saladin took the military threat they posed. But the ordinary soldiers? Most were enslaved by Saladin's forces, as was custom in medieval warfare on both sides. The result of Hattin was staggering. The entire military force of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was gone. The kingdom was now defenseless. Every city, every castle, every fortress wide open. And the greatest prize of all stood undefended. Jerusalem. Saladin was about to do something that would be remembered forever, not just for what he did, but for how he did it. The mercy of Jerusalem. Saladin's armies had spent the weeks after Hattin sweeping through the Holy Land like a tide. City after city fell. Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Caesarea. Most surrendered quickly. Most were treated with remarkable clemency. And now the army stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. Let's think about what this moment meant. 88 years earlier, in 1099, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem for the first time. What happened when they entered the city has gone down in history as one of the great atrocities of the medieval world. The Crusaders killed thousands of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Contemporary accounts, written by both Christian and Muslim sources, describe streets running with blood. The massacre of Jerusalem in 1099 had never been forgotten, never been forgiven. Now, standing outside the same walls, Saladin had a choice. He could have ordered the same thing. By the brutal logic of medieval warfare, a city that resisted siege could expect no mercy when it fell. The people inside Jerusalem knew this. They were terrified. There were tens of thousands of civilians inside, Christian pilgrims, inhabitants who had lived there for generations, soldiers, priests. The man defending Jerusalem was a knight named Balian of Ibelin. He came out to meet Saladin under a flag of truce and begged for terms. Saladin's initial demand was uncompromising, but then something shifted. Saladin agreed to a negotiated surrender. The terms he offered were extraordinary for the time. Every Christian inhabitant of Jerusalem could leave safely if they paid a ransom. The ransom amounts were set: 10 gold dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who could not pay would be enslaved, but Saladin freed tens of thousands of the poorest inhabitants from his own treasury. His own brother, Salahudin, paid the ransom for 1,000 poor Christians personally. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Christian religious leader, walked out of the city carrying so much treasure that Saladin's advisors begged him to take it. Saladin refused. He had made a deal. He would honor it. He let them go, all of them, and the Christians who had lived there, the Eastern Christians who had inhabited Jerusalem before the Crusaders came, were allowed to stay. Their churches were protected. Their worship continued. Fun fact, when Saladin entered Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, he specifically ordered that there would be no killing, no looting of churches. The contrast with the Crusader conquest of 1099 was so stark that even Christian writers in Europe, who were obviously not fans of Saladin, had to acknowledge the extraordinary mercy of his conduct. In fact, a European Christian chronicler named Tericus, the Grand Preceptor of the Knights Templar, wrote a letter describing the fall of Jerusalem. He was devastated, but he did not accuse Saladin of cruelty, because there was none. Saladin himself wept. He prayed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He had the mosque purified with rosewater. He restored the Dome of the Rock to its original function as an Islamic house of prayer. He had done what he had spent his entire life preparing to do. Jerusalem had been recaptured, and it had been recaptured with honor. Back in Europe, the news landed like a thunderclap. Shock, horror, outrage, and then a call to arms. The Pope declared a new crusade. Kings and knights from across Europe began to gather their forces. They were coming back, and this time they were sending their very best. They were sending the one man who was in many ways Saladin's equal, Richard, the Lionheart, and the clash that would define both their legacies. Chapter 9, Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade. Picture three kings setting out for the Holy Land. King Philip II of France, Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in all of Europe, and King Richard I of England. Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade began assembling in 1189. Frederick Barbarossa, the oldest, most senior of the three kings, drowned crossing a river in what is now Turkey before he even reached the Holy Land, and most of his army dissolved. Philip II of France would fight bravely, but then return home early due to politics. But Richard I of England, was one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval age. He was tall, physically imposing, brave almost to the point of recklessness, an incredibly skilled tactician, and an inspiring leader. He had been fighting wars since he was a teenager. His nickname, the Lionheart, was earned. And when Richard arrived in the Holy Land in 1191, the entire dynamic of the war changed overnight. The siege of the Crusader city of Acre had already been grinding on for nearly 2 years. Saladin's forces had the Crusaders under pressure. But when Richard arrived with his fleet and his troops, fresh and aggressive, the siege rapidly shifted in the Crusaders' favor. Acre fell to the Crusaders in July 1191. And then something happened after Acre that shocked even Saladin, and that remains one of the most controversial episodes of Richard's career. The terms of Acre's surrender included an exchange. The Crusader prisoners held by Saladin would be exchanged for Muslim prisoners held by Richard. Delays in the exchange occurred. The negotiations broke down over disputed terms. Richard, impatient and decisive, made a brutal decision. He ordered the execution of his prisoners, nearly 2,700 Muslim soldiers and civilians. It was also, frankly, a signal that Richard was not going to be the kind of opponent Saladin had faced before. This was not a man to be outmaneuvered by mercy alone. What followed over the next year and a half was one of the most remarkable military confrontations in medieval history, and one of history's most extraordinary relationships between enemies. Let's talk about the strategy, because it's fascinating. Richard's goal was not to recapture Jerusalem right away. His goal was to secure the coastal cities, establish a strong supply line from the sea, and then, from a position of strength, march inland toward Jerusalem. He started moving south along the coast with his army in late summer 1191, and Saladin harassed him constantly. Cavalry attacks, arrow storms, hit-and-run strikes designed to break the Crusader formation. But Richard had studied how to defend against exactly this kind of attack. He kept his formation tight. His infantry marched in disciplined lines, shields outward, absorbing arrow fire without breaking. His cavalry stayed inside the protective wall of foot soldiers, waiting for the right moment. Fun fact, the discipline of Richard's march south along the coast of the Holy Land is considered one of the finest examples of sustained military march discipline in medieval history. Saladin's forces attacked repeatedly and almost constantly for days, and the Crusader formation held together. On September 7th, 1191, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Arsuf. Richard's cavalry finally charged at the perfect moment, and the result was a significant Crusader victory. Saladin's forces were driven back with heavy losses. It was the first major defeat Saladin had suffered in years, and it shook him. But Saladin did not panic. He fell back, regrouped, and employed a strategy of scorched earth, destroying towns, filling wells, burning crops along any route Richard might use to advance on Jerusalem. His goal was to make the inland march so difficult, so logistically impossible, that Richard would eventually give up. And through all of this, through all the battles and the maneuvering and the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, something remarkable was happening on the edges of the conflict. Saladin and Richard were exchanging messages, not just diplomatic communications, real letters, conversations. At various points, Richard's brother Geoffrey and Saladin's brother Salahudin met to negotiate. Gifts were exchanged. When Richard was ill with a fever, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and ice from the mountains, an extraordinary act of chivalry toward an enemy. When Richard's horse was killed under him in battle, Saladin reportedly sent a fresh one. And yet they never met, never sat face to face in the same room, not once. Two great men, circling each other across a landscape of war, never quite reaching out their hands. The second time Richard turned away from Jerusalem, in the summer of 1192, he reportedly covered his face with his shield. He could not bear to look at the city he could not reach. And now, with time running out and both sides exhausted, the moment had come to make peace. Chapter 10. The Treaty of Jaffa and the End of the Crusade. It is September 1192. 3 years of crusading. Thousands dead on both sides. Cities ruined. Whole regions devastated. Richard's army has been fighting in the brutal Middle Eastern heat for over a year. His men are sick, exhausted, and running low on supplies. His kingdom back in England is being threatened by his treacherous brother John. Yes, the same Prince John who appears in the Robin Hood stories. Richard needs to go home. Saladin, too, is exhausted. His empire, stitched together over years of patient work, is straining under the cost of constant war. His health, which had never been perfect, is faltering. His emirs and commanders are weary. Both sides needed peace. And so on September 2nd, 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. The terms were carefully negotiated and reflected the reality on the ground. The Crusaders would keep the coastal strip, the cities they had reconquered, from Jaffa in the south to Acre in the north. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. The wars and fortresses that threatened the coastal cities would be dismantled. And, here is the part that mattered most to both sides, Christian pilgrims would be allowed free and safe access to Jerusalem. They could travel there. They could pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the holiest sites in Christianity. They would be under Muslim protection. Think about that. The man who had taken Jerusalem from the Crusaders was now guaranteeing that Christian worshippers could come and pray there freely. He didn't have to do that. But Saladin had always understood that Jerusalem was holy to Christians too, not just to Muslims. He respected that. After the treaty was signed, something touching happened. Richard sent a message to Saladin saying that he would return, that in 3 years he would come back with a new army to retake Jerusalem. Saladin reportedly sent back a warm and respectful reply. Richard never came back. He was captured in Europe on his way home, held for ransom, and by the time he was freed and back in England, the moment had passed. He died in 1199 from a crossbow wound during a minor siege in France, never returning to the Holy Land. As for Saladin, he watched Richard's ships disappear over the horizon from the coast of the Holy Land, and then he turned and rode back toward Damascus. Jerusalem was his, the Treaty of Jaffa secured it, but Saladin himself had only a few months left to live, and the way he spent those last months says everything about who he really was. Chapter 11. The Last Days of a Great Man. Saladin returned to Damascus in the autumn of 1192. He was 54 or 55 years old. By the standards of medieval life, that was old. By the standards of his life, decades of constant campaigning, 2 assassination attempts, years in the saddle and burning desert heat, it was ancient. He had always been susceptible to illness. He had been sick repeatedly throughout the Egyptian campaigns, throughout the siege of Jerusalem, during the Third Crusade. His body had been pushed to its absolute limit for 30 years. After returning to Damascus, he spent time with his family. He visited the holy cities. He rode out to greet pilgrims returning from the Hajj, the great Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. He gave money to the poor. He talked with scholars and theologians. He seemed, by those who saw him, to be at peace. In February 1193, he fell ill with a fever. His doctors tried everything they knew, but in the medieval world, without antibiotics or modern medicine, a serious fever could be a death sentence. On March 4th, 1193, Saladin died in Damascus. He was in his mid-50s. When his ministers and servants inventoried his possessions to prepare for his burial, they discovered something extraordinary. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who had reunited much of the Islamic world and defeated the greatest crusade in history, had almost nothing left. He had given it away. Over the course of his life, he had given so generously, so constantly, that when he died, there was barely enough money to pay for his funeral. There was too little in his treasury to even buy a proper burial plot. His closest friends had to pay for it themselves. He left almost no gold. He left no vast palaces he had built for himself. He left no personal fortune. He had given it all away, to soldiers who needed pay, to scholars who needed support, to the poor who needed food, to the cities he wanted to rebuild, to the mosques he wanted to restore. Fun fact, a contemporary account says that when Saladin's treasury was examined after his death, all that was found was 1 gold coin and 47 silver dirhams. Not enough to pay even for the basic costs of a burial service. This from a man who had commanded the riches of 2 great empires for decades. He was buried in a simple tomb in Damascus. Today that tomb, in the gardens beside the Umayyad Mosque, is still there. You can still visit it. People still come to pay their respects from every corner of the world, nearly 850 years later. But who exactly was this man? What made him so remarkable that people still remember him today? That's what we'll talk about now. Chapter 12. The Legend and the Legacy. Here's something remarkable. In the medieval world, enemies did not usually speak well of each other. Kings and warriors were proud and competitive, and the literature of the time was full of people calling their enemies monsters and villains. Saladin was different. The Christian writers who wrote about him, men who were, remember, on the other side of every one of these wars, could not stop praising him. They called him generous, they called him chivalrous, they called him just, they called him a man of his word. That is almost unheard of in the medieval sources about enemy leaders. So what actually made Saladin so extraordinary? Let's think about it carefully, because he wasn't perfect, and great history means we look at the whole picture. His mercy. Over and over again, Saladin chose mercy when he could have chosen violence. The fall of Jerusalem is the clearest example, but there were dozens of others. Cities he allowed to surrender on honorable terms, prisoners he released, enemies he treated with dignity. Medieval warfare was brutal, and Saladin lived in that world and sometimes made brutal decisions, but he consistently tried to limit unnecessary suffering in ways that surprised and moved even his enemies. His generosity. Saladin was, by all accounts, compulsively generous. He found it genuinely difficult to say no to anyone who came to him in need. His administrators often despaired because he would give away money faster than they could collect it. He is said to have sometimes signed over tax revenues from entire districts to pay for a scholar's research or a widow's support, and then discovered he had no money left to pay his own soldiers. His faith. Saladin was a deeply devout Muslim. This was not performance, it was genuine. He prayed 5 times a day throughout his life, even on campaign. He studied theology. He surrounded himself with scholars. His religious faith was the foundation of everything else he did. His sense of justice, his commitment to mercy, his ability to inspire others. His complexity. Here is the honest part. Saladin was not a saint. He made hard, sometimes ruthless decisions when he felt they were necessary. The execution of the Templar and Hospitaller Knights after Hattin, the execution of Reynald of Chatillon, the scorched earth strategy during the Third Crusade. He was a man of his time, operating in a world of brutal power and survival. To understand him fully, you have to hold all of that together. The mercy and the harshness, the generosity and the ruthlessness. That's what real historical thinking looks like. Not good guys and bad guys, but real human beings, making real choices under real pressure. Saladin became so famous in Europe after his death that he appeared as a character in European literature for centuries, including in works by Dante, Boccaccio, and Lessing. He was often used as an example of a noble, honorable infidel, which was the European Christian term at the time for someone of a different faith, to contrast with corrupt Christian leaders of the era. Even his enemies thought he was great. His dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty, named for his father Ayyub, ruled Egypt, Syria, and parts of the surrounding region for decades after his death. It was a Muslim empire built on the foundations he had laid. And Jerusalem. It remained in Muslim hands after Saladin, with only a brief interruption, for centuries. But here's perhaps the most important part of Saladin's legacy, the part that matters most for us, thinking about it today. Saladin showed that power and goodness are not opposites. He showed that it is possible to be a fierce and effective leader and a merciful and generous human being at the same time. He showed that how you treat your enemies says as much about your character as how you treat your friends. He believed, and he lived as though he believed, that his faith was not just a banner to wave before a battle. It was a code of conduct, a way of being in the world. You don't have to share his faith to admire that. You don't have to agree with every decision he made to recognize his greatness. What you do have to do is pay attention, because the world still needs people who understand that true strength includes mercy, that true leadership includes humility, that the most powerful thing a leader can do is sometimes to put down the sword. Chapter 13, looking back, what does Salahudin mean today? So, we've traveled a long way together, haven't we? We started in Tikrit with a newborn baby whose father wasn't sure whether his birth was a good sign or a bad one. We followed that baby through Baalbek and Damascus, through the great libraries and the training yards, through the deserts of Egypt and the hills of Syria and the walls of Jerusalem. We watched that boy become a student, a soldier, a commander, a vizier, a sultan, a conqueror, and, at the end of it all, a man who died with almost nothing because he had given everything away. Here's a question for you, and you can actually think about this. If you had to choose one word to describe Salahudin, what would it be? Would you say powerful, merciful, faithful, wise, complex? Here's my answer. Principled. He was a man of principles. He knew what he believed. He knew what he was for. And even when it was costly, even when it would have been easier to be cruel, to be greedy, to be small, he tried to act in accordance with those principles. That doesn't make him perfect. We've seen the places where he made hard choices that cost lives. History is honest about that. But across a lifetime of almost unimaginable power, he led armies, commanded empires, decided the fates of cities. He never lost sight of something deeply human. He never forgot that the people on the other side of the battlefield were also people. Fun fact, today statues of Salahudin stand in Damascus and Tikrit. His image appears on the coats of arms of several Arab nations. He is remembered across the Islamic world as one of the greatest leaders in history, and he is remembered in Europe too as a figure of extraordinary chivalry and nobility. Almost no other medieval leader is so deeply respected on so many sides of so many divides. Think about what that means. In a world that was torn apart by religion, by ethnicity, by culture, a Kurdish boy from a little city on the Tigris River grew up to be admired by Muslim scholars, Christian chroniclers, European poets, and modern historians alike. Not because he was invincible, not because he was ruthless, but because in the middle of all that war and chaos and power, he managed to be good. Or at least, he genuinely sincerely tried. And maybe that's the most human thing about him. Not that he was a perfect hero, but that he tried. Every single day, he tried. Before we go, I want to bring it back to that cold open, that scorching battlefield, that moment before the Battle of Hattin. Salahudin standing there, calm, patient, absolutely certain of what he was doing and why. Do you know what Salahudin reportedly said to his commanders as the battle was about to begin? Something like this, that they were fighting not just for territory or for glory, but for the welfare of all the Muslims in the region. Not for him personally, not for his dynasty, for the people. That orientation toward something larger than yourself was with him from beginning to end. From the baby in Tikrit, to the student in Damascus, to the vizier in Cairo, to the sultan on the battlefield, to the dying man in his simple bed with no treasure left, he was always asking the same question. Not what can I take, but what can I give? That question is one worth carrying with you. Not just when you're learning history, but whenever you find yourself in a position of power, even a small kind of power, as a friend, a student, someday perhaps as a leader of something yourself. What can you give? What kind of story do you want people to tell about you 850 years from now? My name is Prezenem. Thank you for spending this time with Salahudin, Salahudin Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Righteousness of the faith. He deserved the name,